We all make jokes about it. Greenland is ice, Iceland is green. It's one of those fun facts you share at parties, a quirk of geography that makes people chuckle. But what if I told you that name wasn't just some random mistake or coincidence? What if I told you it was deliberate? What if the name Greenland was actually the most successful marketing lie in medieval history? A con so audacious it convinced hundreds of families to sail into the unknown, toward a frozen wasteland they believed would be paradise. This is the story of Erik the Red, a Viking outlaw, a murderer, and perhaps the world's first marketing genius. This is the story of how one man's desperation and cunning created a colony built on deception, blood, and broken promises. This is the story of the Viking Fyre Festival. To understand how this all happened, we need to go back to the year 982 in Iceland. Iceland itself was a relatively new settlement at this point. The Norse had only been there for about a century, and life was hard. The island was volcanic, the winters were brutal, and resources were scarce. It was a place where disputes could turn deadly in an instant, where honor meant everything, and where blood feuds could last generations. Erik Thorvaldsson, who would later be known as Erik the Red because of his fiery red hair and beard, was living in Iceland with his family. He wasn't born there. Erik was actually born in Norway, but his father, Thorvald Asvaldsson, had been exiled from Norway for committing manslaughter. So the family had fled to Iceland, hoping to start fresh in this harsh new land. But Erik, it seems, had inherited his father's temper. He was known to be proud, quick to anger, and unwilling to back down from a fight. These weren't necessarily bad qualities in Viking culture. Vikings respected strength and courage, but Erik's temper would ultimately be his downfall, at least in Iceland. The trouble started over something that seems almost trivial by our standards today. Erik had some slaves, and these slaves caused a landslide that damaged his neighbor's property. The neighbor, a man named Valthjof, was understandably upset, but instead of just demanding compensation or taking Erik to court, Valthjof's friend, a man named Eyjolf the Foul, decided to take matters into his own hands. Eyjolf killed Erik's slaves as revenge. Now, in Viking society, this was a serious offense. Slaves were property, and killing someone's property was essentially theft and destruction. Erik was furious. He wasn't going to let this insult stand. So Erik did what any hot-headed Viking would do. He hunted down Eyjolf the Foul and killed him. He also killed another man named Holmgang Hrafn, probably because Hrafn was associated with Eyjolf or had insulted Erik in some way. The sagas aren't entirely clear on all the details, but the result was the same. 2 men were dead by Erik's hand. This triggered a blood feud. The families of the dead men demanded justice. They took Erik to court, the local assembly, the thing, where disputes were settled according to Viking law. Erik was found guilty of manslaughter. The punishment wasn't execution or imprisonment. In Viking Iceland, the most serious punishment was outlawry. Erik was declared an outlaw, which meant he was banished from his home district for 3 years. He had to leave, and if anyone found him in the forbidden areas during that time, they had the legal right to kill him without consequence. Erik moved to another part of Iceland, to some islands off the coast, hoping to lay low and wait out his exile. But Erik's temper hadn't cooled. He lent some valuable wooden beams, important building materials in a place with few trees, to a man named Thorgest. When Erik later asked for the beams back, Thorgest refused to return them. Another dispute, another insult. And once again, Erik's response was violence. Erik went to Thorgest's farm and took his beams back by force. Thorgest chased after him. A fight broke out. In the chaos, Erik killed Thorgest and several of Thorgest's sons. Now Erik had even more blood on his hands. Thorgest's family demanded justice. Once again, Erik was taken to the thing. Once again, he was found guilty. But this time, the sentence was harsher. Erik the Red was declared a full outlaw, not just from a district, but from all of Iceland. He had 3 years to leave the island entirely. If he stayed, he was a dead man. So there Erik was, a man in his 30s, a husband and father, now a 2-time killer with nowhere to go. He couldn't go back to Norway. His father had been exiled from there. Iceland had just kicked him out. He needed a new home, a new land, a fresh start. But where? Erik had heard stories. Sailors sometimes talked about land to the west of Iceland. Decades earlier, a man named Gunnbjorn Ulfsson had been blown off course during a voyage and claimed to have seen islands or a coastline far to the west. No one had bothered to explore it properly. It was too far, too dangerous, too unknown. But for Erik, a man with no options, the unknown was his only option. In the summer of 982, Erik gathered a crew, outfitted a ship, and sailed west into the open Atlantic. He was venturing into waters that few had dared to cross, heading toward a land that might not even exist. But Erik was desperate, and desperation, as we'll see, can make a man very creative. After days at sea, battling waves and wind, Erik and his crew finally spotted land. It was a massive island, far larger than Iceland. Erik sailed along its eastern coast, searching for a place to land. But what he found wasn't promising. The eastern shore was a wall of ice, glaciers tumbling into the sea, mountains covered in snow. a landscape that looked utterly inhospitable. But Erik didn't give up. He sailed around the southern tip of the island and up the western coast. And there he found something different. The western fjords were still cold, still harsh, but they were less icy. There were patches of green in the valleys during summer. There was grass, there were sheltered bays, there were seals and fish. It wasn't paradise, but it was survivable. Erik spent the next 3 years exploring this new land. He mapped the coastline. He found the best spots for settlement. He hunted and fished. He survived. And during those 3 years, alone in that vast frozen wilderness, Erik started to think. He thought about his future. He thought about his family back in Iceland. He thought about what it would take to build a new life in this place. And then Erik had an idea, a brilliant, devious, audacious idea. Erik realized that he couldn't settle this land alone. It was too big, too harsh. He would need help. He would need farmers, craftsmen, laborers. He would need a community. But who, in their right mind, would voluntarily sail into the unknown to settle a frozen island? Erik understood human psychology. He understood that people are drawn to opportunity, to the promise of something better. He understood that branding matters. And he understood that if he told people the truth, that this new land was a desolate, icy rock barely suitable for human habitation, no one would come. So Erik made a decision. He would lie. He would rebrand this frozen wasteland. He would give it a name that would make it sound appealing, inviting, fertile. He would call it Greenland. Think about that for a moment. Erik the Red, a convicted killer, an exile, was about to launch the medieval world's first marketing campaign. He was going to sell people on a destination he knew was nothing like its name suggested. He was going to use the power of branding to trick desperate, land-hungry families into risking everything for a lie. When Erik's 3-year exile ended, he returned to Iceland. He came back with stories. He talked about the new land he'd found. He described it as green, fertile, full of potential. He called it Greenland. The name itself was a promise. It suggested lush pastures, good farming, prosperity. And here's the thing. Iceland in the late 10th century was struggling. The population was growing. Land was scarce. Feuds were constant. Winters were getting harsher. Farms were failing. People were hungry. People were desperate for a fresh start, for new opportunities, for a chance at a better life. Erik's timing was perfect. He wasn't just selling a place. He was selling hope. He went from farm to farm, from village to village, telling his tale. He showed people the route. He promised them land, as much as they could work. He painted a picture of a place where they could be free from the feuds and crowding of Iceland, where they could build something new. And people believed him. Why wouldn't they? Erik was a known figure. He was from a prominent family. He was a skilled navigator who had survived 3 years in this new land. And most importantly, he had given it a name that suggested it was worth the risk. 25 ships prepared to set sail in the summer of 985. 25 ships full of families, livestock, tools, supplies. Hundreds of people, perhaps as many as 500, ready to stake their futures on Erik's promise. Imagine the scene. The docks crowded with people saying goodbye to loved ones they might never see again. Children excited for adventure. Women worried but hopeful. Men determined to claim their share of this new Greenland. Ships loaded down with everything these families owned. Every possession, every animal, every seed for planting. And then they set off. 25 ships sailing west into the Atlantic, following Erik the Red toward Greenland. But the Atlantic Ocean is not kind. It's one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth, especially in small Viking ships. The journey from Iceland to Greenland was roughly 450 miles of open ocean. There were no landmarks, no GPS, no weather forecasts. Sailors navigated by the sun and stars, by the flight of birds, by the color of the water, and they were entirely at the mercy of the weather. The fleet ran into storms, massive waves, howling winds. Ships were separated. Some were blown off course. Some took on water. Some simply vanished beneath the waves. Of the 25 ships that left Iceland, only 14 made it to Greenland. 11 ships were lost. That's nearly half the fleet. Hundreds of people drowned. Families were torn apart. Dreams sank to the bottom of the ocean. But the survivors pressed on. They had come too far to turn back. They had nothing to return to. So when they finally spotted the coast of Greenland, when they sailed into the western fjords, they must have felt relief. They had made it. They had survived. And then they saw the reality. Greenland was not green. It was ice. It was rock. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape that barely resembled the paradise Erik had described. Yes, there were some patches of grass in the valleys. Yes, the fjords offered some shelter, but this was not the lush farmland they had imagined. This was a place where survival would be a constant struggle. They had been conned. They had been lied to. They had risked everything, lost friends and family at sea, and arrived at a frozen wasteland. But what could they do? They couldn't go back. They had no ships capable of making the return journey safely. They had burned their bridges in Iceland. They were stuck. So they did the only thing they could do. They settled. They built. They survived. Erik the Red established the first settlement at a place he called Brattahlid, which became the capital of the Greenland colony. Other settlers spread out along the western coast, claiming fjords and valleys, building farms and homes. They raised sheep and cattle. They hunted seals and whales. They traded walrus ivory and furs. They made it work. And Erik became the undisputed leader of this new colony. He was the chieftain, the founder, the man who had brought them there. Despite the lies, despite the losses, Erik commanded respect. He had, after all, survived 3 years alone in this place. He knew the land. He knew how to live here. The Greenland colony grew. At its peak, it had around 5,000 inhabitants spread across 2 main settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, which is confusing because the Western Settlement was actually northeast of the Eastern Settlement, but that's Viking naming logic for you. The colonists built churches. They established trade routes back to Iceland and Norway. They even sent expeditions further west to what they called Vinland, which we now know was North America. Erik's son, Leif Erikson, would become famous for being one of the first Europeans to set foot in the New World, centuries before Columbus. But life in Greenland was never easy. The climate was harsh. The growing season was short. The colonists were entirely dependent on trade for things like iron and timber, which Greenland lacked. They were isolated, cut off from the rest of the Norse world for months at a time during winter. And there was always the knowledge, the unspoken truth, that they had been tricked, that the name Greenland was a lie, that Erik the Red had sold them a dream and delivered a nightmare. But here's the fascinating thing. The lie worked, not just in getting people to come, but in keeping them there. The name Greenland became a source of pride. It was their land. They had built it. They had survived here. The name was a claim, a defiant statement that they had tamed this place, that they had made it theirs. And for centuries, the colony endured. It survived plague, climate change, conflict with the indigenous Inuit people, and the gradual decline of trade with Europe. The Greenland Norse were some of the toughest, most resilient people in medieval history. But eventually, the colony failed. By the 15th century, the settlements were abandoned. The last Norse Greenlanders either died out or left. The reasons are still debated. Climate change made farming even harder. The Little Ice Age brought colder winters and shorter summers. Trade routes collapsed. The Black Death decimated Europe and disrupted the networks the Greenlanders relied on. Conflict with the Inuit increased. The colonists may have become too isolated, too rigid in their ways, unable to adapt. But for nearly 500 years, Greenland was home to a Norse colony founded on a lie. And that lie, that marketing trick, that rebranding of a frozen wasteland as a green paradise, was the work of one man. Erik the Red, murderer, exile, con artist, founding father. Erik himself lived a long life by Viking standards. He died of disease, probably around the year 1003, just as Christianity was beginning to spread through Greenland. His wife, Theodild, had converted, and she famously built a small church, refusing to sleep with Erik until he too converted. Erik never did. He remained a pagan to the end, stubborn and proud, just as he had always been. And in a way, Erik's story is the perfect embodiment of the Viking spirit. Vikings were explorers, warriors, traders, and yes, sometimes liars and thieves. They were opportunists who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. They were willing to take enormous risks for the promise of something better. They were survivors. Erik the Red saw a frozen island and called it Greenland. He saw a desperate population in Iceland and sold them a dream. He convinced 500 people to risk their lives on his word. 11 ships sank, hundreds died, but 14 ships made it. A colony was born. And for 5 centuries, people lived, worked, loved, and died in Greenland, all because one man understood the power of a name. The story of Erik the Red and Greenland doesn't end with the founding of the colony. In fact, in many ways, the real story is just beginning, because what happened next reveals even more about the nature of this lie, about the resilience of the people who fell for it, and about how history remembers and reshapes the truth. Let's start with the survivors, those 14 ships that made it to Greenland in 985. Imagine being on one of those vessels. You've just survived a harrowing ocean crossing. You've watched ships disappear in storms. You've seen people you knew, maybe people you loved, swallowed by the sea. You've endured days of terror, cold, hunger, and uncertainty. And then you arrive. You step onto the shore of Greenland, and you realize you've been sold a fantasy. What do? Do you confront Erik? Do you demand to go back? Some probably did. The sagas hint at tensions, at arguments, at anger. But the practical reality was undeniable. These families had committed everything. They had sold their farms in Iceland, packed their belongings, brought their animals. They had nowhere else to go. The ships that brought them were damaged, exhausted. The crews were depleted. Turning around and sailing back to Iceland immediately wasn't an option. And even if it were, what would they return to? They had left Iceland because life there was hard. Going back meant admitting defeat, returning to a place where they had no land, no prospects, no future. So they stayed, and they adapted. And this is where the story becomes less about Erik the Liar and more about the ordinary people who made his lie into a reality. The Norse Greenlanders were incredibly resourceful. They quickly learned that traditional Icelandic farming wouldn't work in Greenland. The growing season was too short. The soil was too poor. So they adjusted. They focused on livestock that could survive the cold. Sheep, goats, and cattle, but in smaller numbers than in Iceland. They relied heavily on hunting. Seals became a staple. The colonists hunted them for meat, for oil, for skins. They hunted caribou in the interior. They hunted walrus for their valuable ivory tusks, which became Greenland's primary export to Europe. They fished. The waters around Greenland were rich with fish, and the colonists became skilled fishermen. They built boats, set nets, and learned to read the ocean just as their ancestors had. They also traded with the indigenous peoples they encountered. The Norse called them Skraelings, a term that probably encompassed both the Dorset people and later the Thule people, ancestors of the modern Inuit. The relationship between the Norse and the indigenous peoples was complex. There's evidence of trade. Norse artifacts have been found in Inuit sites and Inuit artifacts in Norse sites, but there's also evidence of conflict. The sagas mention skirmishes, raids, and mutual distrust. The Norse saw themselves as superior, as civilized Christians bringing order to a wild land. The indigenous peoples saw the Norse as strange invaders on their traditional hunting grounds. This tension would simmer for centuries and may have contributed to the eventual collapse of the Norse colony. But in those early years, the colony grew. Erik established himself at Brattahlid, and other chieftains claimed their own territories. They built longhouses, barns, and churches. They created a society modeled on what they had known in Iceland, with a thing for settling disputes, a system of laws, and a social hierarchy. And here's the important part. They made it work. Against all odds, in one of the harshest environments on Earth, the Norse Greenlanders built a functioning society. They had farms, churches, and trade networks. They raised families. They celebrated festivals. They told stories. They lived. And the name Greenland stuck. It became the identity of the colony. It was a name that represented not what the land was, but what the people had made of it. It was a defiant claim. Yes, it's cold. Yes, it's hard. But it's ours. And we call it Greenland. Erik the Red himself became a legendary figure even in his own lifetime. He was the founder, the chieftain, the man who had led them to this new world. His family became the most prominent in Greenland. His son, Leif Erikson, would go on to explore even further west, becoming the first known European to reach North America around the year 1000. Leif's journey to Vinland is a story in itself. According to the sagas, Leif heard tales from a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had been blown off course and spotted land to the west of Greenland. Leif decided to investigate. He gathered a crew, sailed west, and found a land rich with timber, wild grapes, and salmon. He called it Vinland, meaning wineland or meadowland. Leif established a small settlement there, probably in what is now Newfoundland. Archaeological evidence from a place called Lons aux Meadows confirms that the Norse did indeed reach North America centuries before Columbus. But the Vinland colony didn't last. The distance from Greenland was too great. The indigenous peoples were hostile. After a few years, the Norse abandoned Vinland and returned to Greenland. But the fact that they tried, the fact that they explored even further into the unknown, tells you something about the spirit of these people. They were the children of Erik's lie, but they had made that lie their reality. They had embraced the identity of Greenlanders. They had turned a con into a culture. Back in Greenland, life continued. The colony reached its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries. By then, there were around 5,000 Norse Greenlanders living in two main settlement areas. The eastern settlement, which was actually in the southwest, was the larger and more prosperous. This is where Brattahlid was located. The western settlement was smaller, more remote, and even harsher. The Greenlanders built impressive structures. The ruins still exist today. Stone churches, some with beautiful carvings, large farmhouses with thick turf walls for insulation, barns for livestock. They even had a bishop. Greenland was officially part of the Catholic Church, and the Pope appointed bishops to oversee the spiritual life of the colony. The fact that Greenland, one of the remotest outposts of Christendom, had its own bishop shows how integrated the colony had become into the medieval European world. Trade was essential. Greenland had no iron, no timber, and no grain. These had to be imported from Iceland and Norway. In exchange, the Greenlanders exported walrus ivory, walrus hide rope, which was prized for its strength, polar bear skins, live polar bears as exotic gifts for European royalty, and furs. Walrus ivory was especially valuable because it was a substitute for elephant ivory, which was harder to obtain, but trade was precarious. Ships could be lost at sea, routes could be disrupted. And the Greenlanders were entirely dependent on maintaining these connections. In the early 14th century, things began to go wrong. First, the climate started to change. The medieval warm period, which had made the initial settlement of Greenland possible, was ending. The Little Ice Age was beginning. Temperatures dropped, winters became longer and harsher, ice expanded. The already short growing season shrank even further. Livestock died, hay harvests failed, survival became even harder. Second, trade routes began to collapse. The Black Death struck Europe in the mid-14th century, killing perhaps a third of the population. Norway, which had been Greenland's primary trading partner, was devastated. The Norwegian crown lost interest in maintaining distant colonies. Ships stopped coming. The Greenlanders were increasingly isolated. Third, the market for walrus ivory collapsed. Elephant ivory from Africa became more accessible as European trade networks expanded. Walrus ivory lost its value. Greenland's primary export was now worthless. And fourth, the relationship with the indigenous Thule people, who were expanding into Greenland from the north, became more strained. The Thule were better adapted to the Arctic environment than the Norse. They used kayaks, dog sleds, and sophisticated hunting techniques. They thrived in conditions that the Norse struggled with. There's evidence of increasing conflict. Norse artifacts show signs of raids. The western settlement, the smaller and more remote of the two, was abandoned around 1360. We don't know exactly why. The farms were simply left behind, animals still in their pens, suggesting a sudden departure. Were they wiped out by the Thule? Did they flee to the eastern settlement? Did they starve? We don't know. The eastern settlement held on longer, but by the early 15th century, it too was failing. Ships from Europe stopped coming altogether. The last recorded contact with Greenland was a wedding in 1408. After that, silence. When European explorers finally returned to Greenland in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they found the Norse settlements abandoned. The farms were ruins, the churches were empty, the people were gone. Some explorers found frozen bodies in Norse clothing, the last remnants of a vanished colony. What happened to the last Greenlanders? That's one of history's great mysteries. Did they die of starvation and disease? Did they leave, somehow making the dangerous journey back to Iceland or Norway? Did they intermarry with the Inuit and lose their Norse identity? Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests some mixing did occur, but the Norse colony as a distinct entity simply vanished. And here's the tragic irony. The Inuit thrived in Greenland. They still live there today. Greenland is now part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but the majority of its population is Inuit. They adapted to the environment in ways the Norse never could or would. The Norse clung to their European ways, to their livestock, to their churches, to their identity as Christians and farmers. They refused to fully adopt Inuit technologies and lifestyles, even when those would have helped them survive. Their cultural stubbornness, their refusal to adapt, may have doomed them. So, what does the story of Erik the Red in Greenland teach us? First, it shows the power of branding and marketing. Erik understood that perception matters. He understood that a name could shape reality. By calling the land Greenland, he made it appealing. He made it seem like an opportunity. And that name has lasted over 1,000 years. Even today, Greenland is called Greenland, even though it's mostly ice. The lie became the truth, at least in name. Second, it shows the resilience of human beings. The people who settled Greenland knew they had been deceived, but they made the best of it. They adapted. They survived for nearly 500 years in one of the harshest places on Earth. That's an incredible achievement. These weren't just victims of a con. They were pioneers, survivors, builders. Third, it shows the limits of adaptability. The Norse Greenlanders were resilient, but they weren't flexible enough. They held onto their European identity too tightly. They didn't learn from the indigenous peoples around them. And in the end, that inability to fully adapt may have been their downfall. And fourth, it reminds us that history is full of uncomfortable truths. We like to think of explorers and colonizers as heroes, as brave adventurers spreading civilization. But the reality is often messier. Erik the Red was a killer and a liar. The Greenland colony was founded on deception and desperation. The Norse Greenlanders displaced indigenous peoples and exploited the land, and yet they were also ordinary people trying to build a life, trying to survive, trying to create something lasting. History is complicated, people are complicated, and the story of Greenland is a perfect example of that complexity. Today, Greenland is in the news again. Climate change is melting its ice sheet at an alarming rate. The name Greenland, Erik's lie, is becoming more accurate. Parts of Greenland are turning green as temperatures rise and glaciers retreat. It's a bitter irony. The land that was named green as a trick might actually become green, but for all the wrong reasons. Greenland is also politically significant. It has vast natural resources, rare earth minerals, oil, and gas that are becoming accessible as the ice melts. Countries around the world, including the United States, China, and Russia, are interested in Greenland's future. There's been talk of independence from Denmark. There's been talk of purchasing Greenland, a suggestion that caused international controversy. And through all of this, the Inuit people of Greenland, the descendants of the Thule who outlasted the Norse, are asserting their rights and their identity. They are the ones who truly made Greenland their home. They are the ones who adapted and survived. So when we look back at Erik the Red, when we think about his lie and the colony it created, we have to hold multiple truths at once. Yes, he was a con artist. Yes, he deceived people. Yes, people died because of his lie. But also, yes, he founded a colony that lasted half a millennium. Yes, he enabled the first European exploration of North America. Yes, he created a culture and an identity that still resonates today. Erik the Red was a complex figure in a complex story. He was a product of his time, a Viking in every sense of the word. Violent, cunning, ambitious, and bold, he saw an opportunity and seized it. He bent the truth to serve his needs, and in doing so, he changed history. The story of Greenland is a story about the power of names, the resilience of people, the harshness of nature, and the stubbornness of culture. It's a story about what happens when desperation meets opportunity. It's a story about survival and failure. It's a story about a lie that became a legend. And it all started with a red-haired killer standing on a frozen shore, looking out at a desolate landscape and deciding to call it green. This is John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.